A very good evening to you, and thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Spectrum. We are coming to you live from the Stool Street here in the heart of our city, Kampala, in the central building. But you're also broadcasting live on our website, which is www.radio1fm90.com. You click on the icon with the word Listen Live. You can still find this radio station on the different radio listening apps that can be obtained from the Google Store of your smartphone. Look for any and tune into Radio 1 FM 90. You'll be able to listen to us from anywhere across this globe. The other option, we are on DSTV. Our audio channel there is 897, and on StarTimes our audio channel is 97. Two ways to contribute to this discussion. One of the ways is to send in a message via the WhatsApp line 0703 090 090. It could be a question or comment. The guests in studio will be able to respond to you. Time allowing, I'll open the phone lines for you to call in and contribute with your voice. My name is Kenneth Lukwagandason, your host, and today we'll be looking at the US-Africa relations, what is likely to change with the outcomes of the next election. Now, on Tuesday, November 5th this year, citizens of the United States, home and abroad, will cast their ballots to elect the 47th president and his or her vice president, who will be serving for a term of 4 years. The incumbent, President Joe Biden, a member of the Democratic Party, is running for re-election, and from the look of things, the embattled 46th president of the United States, Donald Trump, is likely to be his main rival. Now, the whole world is following closely this election, not only because of the likely stiff competition, but also the implications in terms of how the U.S. will relate with other countries. Now, Africa and its countries like Uganda have been long-term partners with the U.S. But over the last few years, the U.S. has taken a tough stance on issues of human rights, leading to several sanctions and revision of trade arrangements, including AGOA. So what exactly should countries like Uganda expect if the Democratic Party retain power or if the Republicans win? Is the U.S. right to impose sanctions and revise trade arrangements such as AGOA? What lessons can Uganda take from these sanctions and trade-related restrictions? My guest this evening, Professor Denis Matanda, Professor of American Politics and International Business at the Catholic University of Washington, D.C. Good evening, Professor Matanda, and thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, I had no choice. Thank you for having me.
What do you mean you had no choice?
I really wanted to come. This is a great topic, and, I really wanted to come and have this chat with you.
All right. You are a Ugandan based in the United States.
I am.
And very many people are closely following what is happening in the U.S. because of what happened during the Donald Trump presidency and what has been happening in Joe Biden's presidency. The following competition between the Republicans and the Democrats. For you as a person now who lives in the U.S., but it is also to relate to Ugandans who are here, why is this election so important to Uganda or even the world at large?
Every single election for the American president or for an American president is absolutely important because the United States plays a seminal role to almost everything. Let me give you an example. Official development assistance from the United States to any of the countries, to Egypt, to Israel, to Uganda, to Kenya, is a larger amount than they can have from any other country, from China or whatever. Official development assistance is very important. But related to that, there's capital markets. The United States development finance institutions are huge. The United States private banks are huge. Related to that, look at the Fortune 2000, look at the Fortune 500, look at the Fortune 100. The multinational corporations from the United States are the largest in the world, which means they have the biggest budgets for research and development. They will lead social media, and if they wanted to influence anybody, they could. And that's the essence, and that's why it's very important to look at the leader of what they call the free world. This election is of absolute importance as well because it's also going to be one of the longest primaries ever. Because Donald Trump actually is going to be Joe Biden's competitor in November because he has won his primaries and his opponent, Governor Haley, has actually conceded. So from that perspective, you have a long run between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And interestingly, this is also historic because it's been a very long time since two presidents actually went at it. This is very historical, and it's going to be quite interesting.
You notice in my introduction I used the word embattled when I was describing Donald Trump. And so many Ugandans see what is going on, the charges that he faces, the court battles. And people are just wondering how possible that he's going to be on the ballot.
He will be on the ballot, whether he goes to jail or not, because he is the Republican nominee. He is the Republican candidate. So whatever happens, until the Republican Party withdraws him, he will be the candidate for the Republican Party.
How about those who will argue that, look, this is a man who has been charged with a criminal offense? At the other time, he was actually indicted, found to have committed certain offenses, including dodging taxes.
Donald Trump
which is
innocent until proven guilty. Donald Trump is innocent until he exhausts his appeals. Donald Trump will be a free man until he is actually found guilty by all the courts in the land, the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court, whatever it is. He's embattled, yes, because he has 91 charges indicted for all sorts of things. He has state crimes in Georgia. He has state crimes in New York. But he has federal crimes as well in Florida and a federal crime in Washington, D.C. That is 4 cases. That's a right term to use. He has been impeached twice. So he's a historically embattled president. Yeah.
All right. Why is it that he still has that huge following, despite all those challenges that you have highlighted? He still has a huge following in the Republican Party.
Donald Trump came in at a time that was very fortunate. He came in as somebody who had what they call very high name recognition. He had a very popular talk show and everybody knew who he was. He was also a fixture in New York and Chicago and Las Vegas. He had his name on the buildings. So everybody knew him. Secondly, he also came in at a time where he was an opponent to Barack Obama. He was basically asking and questioning Barack Obama's legitimacy. You have to admit that there are people who like that kind of controversy, because that's really, really important, because the United States is made up of 2 polar regions. We have the Republicans, Democrats, we have the Libertarians, you have the Conservatives, you have the Liberals. All those people take a stance. And Donald Trump has managed to appeal to some of those, and very interestingly, he has appealed to some of them very strongly. They like him, they don't care about anything else, because he has also managed to become their mouthpiece.
All right, let's turn the card and look at the other side. Joe Biden. From what people say, he's too old. Some even think he shouldn't be president now, but he retains the ticket for the Democratic Party. Why is this the case?
What do you mean, why is this the case? Actually, I know why. I'm just teasing you. The point is very simple. Joe Biden is president of the United States. Try taking him away from power. The man has all his faculties around him. America has old people that run the Senate. People in the Senate, 86, 87, 91. These people are still running things. Joe Biden as president has been one of the most successful American presidents in America's history. He has passed legislative freedoms. He has passed so many things. And interestingly, under Joe Biden's rule, you have the lowest unemployment in the history of the United States. Things like that. The United States is the world's largest producer of crude oil, much more than Saudi Arabia. What does that tell you? That's under the Joe Biden presidency. The New York Stock Exchange is going gangbusters under Joe Biden. My point is that the United States is 75% private sector money and about 25% government money, federal money from Washington, D.C. What that tells you is the president sometimes doesn't really matter. What really matters is the private sector able to produce. And that's one of the charms. So while the rest of the world has been suffering with very high inflation, with very stagnant growth or whatever, the United States has been growing very, very fast. The United States is very resilient, especially because you have this lovely division between the states, and the federal government. You have a very large country that has numerous resources. And most of all, you have a Republican, when I say Republican, small r, Republican government, whereby we say leave us alone. It's mostly, listen, you guys are doing things in your federal government, we are doing things in our state government, and we, the private sector, which is 75% of the country, does what it wants to do.
All right. Now, let's put the two men on the weighing scale. And I'm sure you've been able to also look at some opinion polls that are already coming out.
Yeah.
Who is likely to win, and why do you think that will be the case?
So if you had asked me this question about 5 years ago, I would have been very, very confident and said, oh yeah, Donald Trump will not win this election, especially because the Democrats are technically a larger number. The Democrats always have a larger popular vote. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016 by 3 million people. Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2020 by over 7 million people. And if you look at the House races, the Senate races, typically speaking, it's the numbers that matter. So from that perspective, there is a chance that Joe Biden will win the election. And the other reason that Joe Biden will win the election is that the Republican Party has managed to do some very unpopular things. Like, for example, it was under Republican judges in the Supreme Court that they overturned something called Roe v. Wade, which was a guarantee of abortion across the United States. That is a challenge to women's rights. That's a challenge to fundamental freedoms. And you know, women are a large number. There's 52% of the American population is young women. You know, they are going to cast their vote. Now let's talk about Donald Trump and why Donald Trump might win. Donald Trump is part of something called a pendulum. Every time you have a president moving things in one direction, if Joe Biden has moved things in one direction, the American people always want to reward somebody who's out of office. In other words, they will blame the person who's in office if the gas prices are very high. They're going to blame the person who's in office if the inflation is very high. From that perspective, Joe Biden could be blamed for these things because the American people, although the economy is doing very, 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 very well, they sometimes don't feel it because of inflation. We have high inflation. It's not as high as people think it is, but they can actually afford to complain.
All right. Now, we have two extremes here, the Republicans and the Democrats. Who is truly the friend of Africa, and in Uganda in particular? So
let's agree on something. American policy for Africa is not made by Republicans or Democrats. I'll say it again. American policy is not made by Republicans or Democrats. It's made by interest groups. It is who has the best interests or who wants the interests to be framed. The biggest challenge you have right now is that those interests are not driven by free market forces. It's not driven by companies. It's not driven by private sector interests. What it's driven by is NGOs. NGOs that want a particular, sector. They want a particular human rights aspect, because ask yourself a question. Some of these countries are very, very bad on human rights. Saudi Arabia, I'm sorry to say, but it is. And how come they have not been sanctioned? But why is it that they come and tack on countries like Zimbabwe or Uganda or Somalia or whatever? It's because these countries don't have the sort of interested parties that can actually defend their interests. It is people that can defend your interests who can actually make your foreign policy.
All right. So I still go back looking at the records. Of course, like you earlier said, Africa and Uganda in particular are beneficiaries of aid and also donor support from most of these countries. So now let's look at the relationship between these two countries and Uganda and the US. And I'm just going to read an extract from the US State Department website, which is a quote by the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, where he says the United States knows that on most of the urgent challenges and opportunities we face, Africa will make the difference. We cannot achieve our goals around the world, whether that's ending the COVID-19 pandemic, building a strong and inclusive global economy, combating the climate crisis or revitalizing democracy and defending human rights without the leadership of African governments, institutions, and citizens. The United States firmly believes that it's time to stop treating Africa as a subject of geopolitics and start treating it as the major geopolitical player it has become. Do you think that is reality?
Yes.
That Africa can now be treated fairly and not be looked at as a subject of geopolitics wherever interests arise? That's when Africa will be considered as a key partner. We have a war in Somalia. That's when Uganda will be considered as a key partner. The US wants to build bases. That's when African countries will be considered as partners. But when it comes to their rights and beliefs, there is a problem there.
I am being coy about this. This is a very loaded question, so let me take it piece by piece. Is it possible that what Mr. Blinken is saying is a reality? Yes, Africa is a major player in the world right now. Africa is a member of the G20, G21 right now. That is major. Africa has 30% of the world's natural resources. Thirdly, Africa has over 28% of the votes in the General Assembly, the United Nations General Assembly. But where are the biggest challenges right now? The reality is that African governments, African countries often let themselves down because they don't have very strong governance institutions. And there's only so much the United States can do. The United States can pump as much official development assistance into Africa as much as it wants. But as long as official development assistance doesn't go out to look for profit maximization, it will remain exactly what it is, disinterested capital. It is just money that comes into this place here. It is so disinterested, it just goes, and what it promotes is consumption and all these other things. You can increase your expenditure and your consumption, but if you don't increase production, it is almost like throwing money on the street and walking on it and saying it's a road. But that money is not being used for the right purpose. Yes, money is used to pay school fees. Money is used to do all kinds of things. But until you have some interested parties in the United States-Africa relationship, you're not necessarily going to achieve as much as you can vis-a-vis a country like Thailand, vis-a-vis a country like Malaysia, vis-a-vis a country like Vietnam. At least the private sector in those entities is very interested. So Mr. Blinken is absolutely right, but he's only speaking for 25% of the United States economy, because the federal government is only 25%. He can speak all he wants, but the reality is that there is a 75% that might not necessarily agree with him.
All right. Countries like Uganda have been beneficiaries of bilateral arrangements with the United States, including Africa, other African states, not Uganda only. Let's use the example of AGOA. We are now in a situation as Uganda where we can no longer trade under AGOA with the United States. First of all, from your observation, is this a blow to Uganda, or is it something that we can ignore? This
is a huge blow, and let me give you some perspective. Earlier today, I actually came in under the Presidential Advisory Committee on Exports and Industrial Development. We had an event at the International Conference Center, and we spent a bit of time, me and Uganda's trade representative, Olivier Kamanzi, we spent a bit of time talking about what the United States means to Africa, or what it means to Uganda. When Uganda lost its benefits in 2024, January 2024, you have one major challenge: a product like vanilla. Uganda is the 8th largest producer of vanilla. But guess what has happened to orders for vanilla from Uganda? It has actually dipped by about 80%. The price of vanilla for Ugandan vanilla is low, especially because a product like AGOA, a program like AGOA, has a very strong signaling effect to basically say, hey, that country is a normal country. Yes, we have what they call NTR, normal trade relations, or MFN, most favored nation, and all those things. Uganda can keep doing all those things, can keep exporting, but AGOA is a fundamental program between the United States and Africa. And so to be kicked out of AGOA is a major debacle. No one should actually underestimate it, especially because of what AGOA is. Not what AGOA represents, but what it is. AGOA is a market access program. It is not what Susan Muhwezi is. It's not a grant from the United States government. In fact, every time you export to the United States, the American taxpayer pays so that you can bring in your products duty-free, quota-free. So you don't pay taxes.
But we're also providing them cheap commodities, you know.
So let's talk about commodities. Let's talk about
as much as they need.
How do you mean?
Well, because of the strategy that you can bring in your goods at duty-free, you are encouraged to bring in the best, and not only the best, but on a quota. Which means,
who deserves, who benefits from that?
Which means the U.S. government is also benefiting by getting cheaper commodities.
But the U.S. government doesn't benefit from AGOA.
It does.
No, it does not.
It does. We supply the U.S. government.
You don't supply the U.S. government at all. You supply the U.S. private sector. The U.S. government does not
which feeds into the U.S. government.
Yes, but it's
the U.S. government. The U.S. government is in charge of the private sector.
No, it's not.
Included.
No, it's not.
The players in the private sector are in the United States.
Yes, they are, but
they pay
not
taxes
yes,
to the United States.
Yes, they do.
So the cheaper they get the commodities, the better they produce.
So let's discuss
and they pay
commodities.
taxes.
Let's discuss commodities. What commodities go to the United States from Uganda? My point is that the commodities that come from Uganda can be sourced elsewhere even cheaper. They can come from Brazil. They can come from Indonesia. I'm talking about coffee. Madagascar supplies 10 times the amount of vanilla that Uganda produces. I'm just saying that Uganda is an optional market. Uganda is not the epitome. Yes, Uganda is the world's second largest producer of Robusta coffee in the United States. Yes, it does that, and it does a really, really great job. But that's also benefiting the private sector. The government never sees that money unless it comes through taxes. It doesn't go to the government and then goes to the private sector. It is a private sector person exporting coffee from Uganda going to a private sector hand. The only way that the government does it is the customs and border patrol. They receive your money, they receive your coffee, tax you. If there are no taxes, they tell you, here's your coffee, go.
Professor Matanda, the reality is that the U.S. government enters into these kinds of negotiations acting on behalf of their citizens, which includes the private sector.
Yes.
So in one way or other, when the private sector pays taxes, the government of the United States also benefits.
I agree. I was actually parsing, I was just splitting hairs.
So what I'm trying to say, it shouldn't be a favor to actually trade with us. Should it?
So with all due respect, AGOA was not negotiated. AGOA is not an agreement. AGOA was not negotiated at all. AGOA is something they give you, and if they give it to you, they can take it away. AGOA is a law which allows the United States government to offset particular aspects when you bring in a particular product, and the original tax was 3.3%. The United States government says, you know what, we will pay that 3.3% for you. We will offset it. We will pay that money actually for whatever product that you bring in. My point is this: the United States does benefit from AGOA, but does not benefit in terms of the volumes of things that come in. Yes, they benefited from the oil that came in from Nigeria, from Angola and all that, but the things that they would like to benefit from are, for example, meat from Namibia. That would actually go to feed a particular population. That is the kind of product that is value added. That's the kind of thing that they would like to see. The Americans don't just want Africa to send commodities. They want you to actually go up the value chain. They want you as Namibia and Botswana to work together with regional value chains and do regional, what they call regional accumulation, improve the product and bring it to the United States. That, in my opinion, is where they want us to go.
Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90. My guest this evening, Professor Denis Matanda, is a professor of American politics and international business at the Catholic University of Washington, D.C. We are looking at the U.S.-Africa relations and what is likely to change with the outcomes of the next election, where Joe Biden is likely to be battling it out with Donald Trump. He says the U.S. policy still remains the same despite the outcomes of this election. When we return from the break, we will be digging deeper into the reasons why the U.S. placed sanctions and decided to revise trade arrangements like AGOA, and what lessons African countries can take from the sanctions and the restrictions that come with them asserting their right as sovereign states. Stay tuned to Radio 1 FM 90. We continue after this break.
Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90. Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90.
I'm glad you're still with us on Spectrum, live on Radio 1 FM 90. Our topic of discussion today is the U.S.-Africa relations, what's likely to change with the outcomes of the next general election expected on the 5th of November this year. My guest is Professor Denis Matanda, Professor of American Politics and International Business at the Catholic University of Washington, D.C. Keep your comments coming via WhatsApp line 0703-090-090, and Professor Matanda will be here to actually respond to them. Now, you have emphasized how important AGOA is to countries like Uganda, but suddenly the U.S. decides you are no longer eligible to do what? To participate under AGOA. The reasons being given because the sovereign state of Uganda took a decision to legislate against what they think is not right. Is that fairness? Is that how you treat partners?
In my opinion, what the United States did was send a démarche to Uganda and say, you guys have done X, Y, and Z. Can we have a conversation about this? They had a conversation about this. And I want to step away from what actually happened to the lessons that a country like Uganda should take.
All right.
My friend Odrek Robogo, the chairperson of the Presidential Advisory Committee on Exports and Industrial Development, was in Washington, D.C. in December. I was right there, and I watched the United States react to Uganda. What's very interesting is there was a subliminal thought that said, but why didn't you guys come and tell us all this stuff that you're telling us now 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months ago? I don't think Uganda had done a good job in communicating. I think that with a partner like the United States, you need to keep as many doors open. You don't do something as seismic as Pass Aha and expect there not to be a repercussion.
Well, we assume that the U.S. has presence here in Uganda.
Yes, they do.
With an embassy that has researchers, people who look into legislation, look into politics, but there are also other avenues to actually talk to the people who passed the law. So they were in the know. What exactly didn't we explain to them?
In my opinion, it's not about explaining. The Ugandan government, and Uganda is a sovereign country, it can do whatever it wants. The point is this. There is something called communicate with your partners, communicate with your friends, because the United States and Uganda are not at war. They have been friends ever since 1962. They communicate. In my opinion, this is a communication snafu. I think that if they had spent a bit of time, and when I say spent a bit of time, I'm talking about my friends in the Ministry of Trade, my friends in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Uganda, what those guys or our friends could have done is wrote and said, hey, guys, I know very well we had a snafu in 2014. We passed something and there were repercussions. This time we've passed something, but we expect you guys to understand that this is the law of our land. Do not surprise your friends. Do not tell your friends, oh, this is our law, you guys can go to hell. We live in a globalized system. There is something called Pacta Sunt Servanda.
Professor Matanda,
yes.
With due respect,
yes.
I think this is promotion of a big man syndrome, where because the US is so powerful, they must domineer all over, on all other countries. I mean, when the US is enacting their laws, we don't question them, do we? Do they inform us as partners that we are going to pass this particular law? So
actually, they
don't
do.
Be surprised.
They do.
Do they?
The United States has one of the most open platforms in the world. You can influence United States policy if you have an interest in influencing it. You could actually go and say, I, as Uganda, want to make sure that there is 250,000 assigned for Karuma Dam in Uganda. And you can pay a lobbyist to make sure that it's appropriated for.
All right, let me give you an example. The world complained about the actions in Libya. The world complained about Guantanamo Bay. The US could not listen. And yet there were justifiable reasons linked to human rights.
I actually disagree.
For all these complaints that came.
I actually disagree. The United States government has been sued countless times by people in the United States because there were interested parties who wanted to take the United States down. Guantanamo Bay has not been sued once or twice or thrice or 4 times. There are people who've been taken off and taken out of Guantanamo Bay. What that tells you is the United States is a country of laws. Uganda could have done almost exactly the same thing, which is just tell your partners, hey, by the way, we're doing this. Respond to a letter that you receive from your friends. Respond to a letter. Say, yes, thank you very much for your letter. We appreciate what you're saying. However, this is the law of our land. Thank you so much. But interestingly, have you seen all the other things we've done in Uganda human rights? Secondly, you could have just said, the DPP has let a message out to say, we do not abuse minorities. Uganda is the same country that allowed people with disabilities into parliament. Uganda is the first or one of the first country that allowed women to actually have special seatings. We had Africa's first vice president. Uganda has so much to tell the world. What Uganda didn't do is remind its friends that we as the Republic of Uganda, now here I speak like a Ugandan, we as the Republic of Uganda actually have good things to tell the world about our human rights record.
All right. You say that Mr. Odriko Rabogo was in the US and you describe him as your friend.
He is my friend.
You say Uganda was not able to do a good job at the time this law was being passed. And at the time Odriko was in the US, we are actually told he had been dispatched to speak to the US government. So yes. Did he do a good job? Or if I can put it right, did you guys do a good job? Are we likely to go back onto the AGOA list?
So this is thank you very much for this very important question. Uganda was only suspended from AGOA.
Initially?
No, right now it has been suspended from AGOA. It's not an indefinite suspension. Uganda can go back and get back into AGOA if it does a few things. The few things it needs to do is 1, communicate, 2, communicate, 3, communicate. Communicate with your partners. Tell them what you are doing in terms of your human rights.
Now, is there a difference between removal and suspension?
Yes.
Well, in October 2023, a letter sent to the Speaker of the US Congress expressed the intentions of President Joe Biden, where he said they had decided to remove 4 countries from the list of AGOA beneficiaries. And Mr. Biden said Uganda had engaged in gross violations of internationally recognized human rights.
Which it did.
So we were removed from the list, not just suspended.
You are suspended. It is a suspension. Technically speaking, Uganda can be reinstated, or Uganda's AGOA benefits can be reinstated. All Uganda has to do is to go back and communicate its progress, because that was one of the requests of the United States government. Tell us, what have you done? There are things that, because I'll tell you something, it's very simple. There could be a misunderstanding, because you think that they understand everything that's happening in Uganda. Sometimes they don't. Go and ask Honorable Norbert Mao what the Ministry of Justice has done for human rights people, or for people's human rights, to shore them up. A simple message from Norbert Mao will actually convince the Americans that Uganda is doing very well in its human rights. Sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they don't have the insights. Sometimes they don't understand what's happening. This is what you call interpretation. There was not enough communication between the United States and Uganda. I think one of the repercussions of it was the suspension of AGOA benefits.
Earlier you stated that one of the biggest challenges that African countries face is lack of institutions and also proper arrangements when dealing with these other development partners. Well, we are likely to continue engaging the development partners for quite some time going forward, issues of trade and so forth. Africa this time is trying to look at inward trade, after
the intra-African trade is brilliant.
Trade, which is brilliant.
Yes.
And I've actually had some people saying if that trade is actually boosted, we would not need to rely on the development partners or even to beg, if I may use that word, to have trade arrangements with them. What lessons do you think Africa need to take?
This is a favorite topic of mine, and I would like to say that the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, is one of the most powerful mechanisms for Africa's development. The reason this is very important is that it allows people to see Africa as one big institution that you can actually put resources into. Also, if you understand U.S. direct investment abroad, so United States direct investment abroad is what they call your FDI. U.S. direct investment abroad likes to go into a region like it did after the Second World War in Europe. It likes to go into a region, develop that region so that people can produce for the region and benefit from the region. In other words, if the Ugandans were very big supporters of the AfCFTA, which they are, one of the things they could fix is the road or air network between Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which means you can allow an American investor to come and invest in fish in here, or invest in chartered flights that will take your fish from Lake Victoria or Lake Narubale all the way to Kinshasa, feeding that market which needs your fish. The other thing that it needs to feed is skin lotion. A simple thing like skin lotion is very expensive in Kinshasa. If Ugandans made skin lotion and took that skin lotion to Kinshasa, there's a very big chance that they could benefit a great deal. Well, an American investor could come in here and actually come, like Procter & Gamble. They could come in here, make skin lotion and export it all the way next door. And guess what? It would be admissible under either the East African Community or COMESA or the AfCFTA.
All right, we have some feedback that is coming in from the listeners, and I think it's time that we attended to them. We have a comment coming in from Anthony, who is listening in from Kibuli. He says, "Good evening, Spectrum. For me, I'm a fan of Donald Trump. He's a good man. Most of those cases leveled against him is just to stop him from contesting. But still, God has picked him up again. And I believe that Africa will benefit from his regime. Let's support him." What do you think about that?
Donald Trump is a good man. However, he has been charged by by juries of his own peers. So the cases against Donald Trump are very legitimate. The United States is a very interesting country. If there were all these biases or people that are trying to get him, they would have been thrown out very easily. That is the beauty about the United States. The institutions are too strong to let something like this go on.
So in the event he's elected president and then he's found guilty,
yes,
what happens?
I don't know. I really do not know.
It's also the first of its kind.
It could be the first of its kind. He could be a president in jail. He could serve his term in jail.
Or the vice president will take over.
Not really. You cannot take over if the president is incapacitated. If he's in jail, his faculties are working. So he could have Secret Service in jail. Or they could decide to sentence him to serve only within the White House. It could be a home.
All right. Another comment comes in. Somebody says, "Thanks, for Professor. Someone finally is expressing the difference between a government and private sector interests and how these coexist. African states fuse business, governance, etc. Government is seemingly providing services of private sector, yet claim a free economy. Professor, we need more we need more lectures on geopolitics. We live in a fallacy. Mr. Lukwago himself has been asking what is Uganda's collective national interests are. That's a comment there from another listener who did not leave an name behind.
I know.
Do you understand what he's saying?
I understand what he is saying. He's basically arguing and saying that we've given him a very interesting dynamic between the United States, which is 75% private sector and 25%, unlike African governments, which are more than 50% most of the time, sometimes the biggest the biggest customer. I mean, one of the reasons that loans are extremely high is because the government borrows from the same banks that you guys borrow. So they would rather lend to the central government. Yeah. So it is a very different dynamic, because the United States can borrow from Social Security, can borrow from other countries around the world because they have a AAA rating for its stocks and bonds. So it's a whole different ball game for the United States. We can't juxtapose the two African countries. And
our next guest is actually talking about the human rights record of the US, and he's saying, what is the guest professor saying? What is happening in Gaza Strip? What is the stand of South Africa and Uganda? Uganda and South Africa seem to tell the United States there needs to be ceasefire.
The United States government is actually asking for a ceasefire as well. The United States government, for one of the first times in the history of the United States, seems to be against the leadership in Jerusalem. I can assure you that there is a need to have a ceasefire. You know why? Interestingly, because the polls are showing that there is a section in Michigan that is not happy with Joe Biden, which means Joe Biden has to react to it, which is, again, interests taking over. If there were no people that were expressing their dissatisfaction with Joe Biden, he would have ignored the Gaza Strip. It is that simple.
We have another comment coming in. Hello, Mr. Presenter. Thanks for the program. Now, you have not asked the professor the reason as to why Uganda was kicked out of the AGOA program. But anyway, we all know why. But be candid and bold. Help the country and tell him. Well, but I think I told you. We passed a law against the law known as the Anti-Homosexuality Act, and there's a strong belief here in Uganda that homosexuality or same-sex marriages and relations are not part of our values. And many Ugandans, and actually the government of Uganda, expect the US to accept that as a decision of the sovereign state of Uganda, but they don't.
What's very interesting is homosexuality is such an unpopular concept in the United States. It is very unpopular.
So why is it being sort of pushed on us?
In my opinion, it comes down to one simple thing. It comes down to interests. There are interest groups in the United States that are influential enough to try and turn the tide of the foreign policy against Uganda.
But what are their interests really?
The interests are human rights, in my opinion, because gay rights are human rights. That's as far as they're concerned.
Well, Professor, as we continue with this discussion, we now need to shift our gears a little bit and look at the Ugandans who are living in the U.S. You as Ugandans who are in the diaspora, and the contribution you're making to this country. But also you have demands as people actually from time to time send in money that helps not only your relatives but also to shove our economy. And at the moment, as a Ugandan living in the diaspora, what would be some of your demands onto your parent country, a country where you originate from?
I am not happy with the Ugandan government for not actually having a fully functional diaspora policy. A diaspora policy is something like what's happening in Malaysia or Indonesia or Vietnam. What's interesting is it doesn't matter how many... Let me just put it like this. Between 2000 and 2022, Africans sent $1.1 trillion to Africa, cumulatively. $1.1 trillion. On average, if you take off each single year, you will imagine that it's probably more than $150 billion. What does that, sorry, about $75 billion. What does that tell you? If you look at the amount of foreign direct investment in Africa, remittances are much more. But you have to ask the question, why is it that remittances have a bigger impact in Asia but don't have a big impact or big enough impact in Africa? Or the impact of remittances in Latin America is much more than the impact of remittances in Africa. It comes down to the government actually having a solid diaspora policy. Has there been a diaspora bond? Have you asked your Ugandan diaspora to contribute $25 million to fix a road network? Have you asked us as the diaspora to lend you money? If you wanted to have $1 billion next week, can you actually come up and ask us to give you that money?
Because can you
guess
raise
what?
it?
Of course. In a heartbeat, we can raise one, because guess what? The average age of the Ugandan in the United States is 47. 47 years of age. They send up to between $300 and $500 back home every single month. If there are 30,000 Ugandans in the diaspora today, right? 30,000 Ugandans. If each of them sent $10, that is $300,000. But guess what? If each of them sent $500, how much is that? That's $150 million already. $150 million. So if you said, guys, over the next 10 months, we would like for you to lend us $1.5 billion, and we will pay it back to you by giving you a chopper, by giving you all these interests or whatever, because we want this money to do X, Y, and Z. They would give it to you. But guess what? The Ugandan government has not come up with a solid plan like that. Secondly, they have not managed to convince us in the diaspora that they will take care of our money.
What do you mean take care of your money?
Can you guarantee that no one is going to steal our money and buy a new car and buy a new house and marry a third wife? Can you guarantee us that if we give you our money, you will use it for the purpose to which you said you would use it for?
But you'll be lending to government, not to individuals.
Yes, guess what? Sometimes we don't trust the government, because guess what? Many of the people who leave this country as economic refugees, or oftentimes they leave as anti-government people. So you have to trust, you have to look at them as a skeptical audience. And I think that the government needs to reach out to them and do something about that. I'm very lucky that I'm not skeptical about the Ugandan government. I mean, I'm working right now for the Ugandan government as well. So it helps a great deal that I understand the intricacies. But guess what? The vast majority of my friends, my brothers, my sisters in the diaspora do not see the things I see.
All right. One of the other aspects that always stands out wherever I speak to people like you is the fact that Uganda has not done enough to market its potential out there. What can you say about that?
Uganda has not done enough to market its potential. It's as simple as that. Uganda does not do enough. Uganda has not done enough. Now, I don't want to sit here and blame my friends at the Uganda Investment Authority or the Uganda Tourism Board. I don't want to blame them. All I want to say is Tanzania is doing a much better job than you. Kenya is doing a much better job than you. And for crying out loud, Rwanda is doing a much
Why do you have to cry out loud when it comes to Rwanda?
Because of one simple thing. Rwanda is doing a stellar job. For an economy that is so small, an economy that has such small resources, it has perfected the art of marketing and communicating.
So what have we failed to do?
Communicating and marketing. We have the products. We have the people. Uganda is the world's most entrepreneurial country. Not by half or by far. It is by many times far. It is more entrepreneurial than its next Thailand and the Philippines. Uganda is the world's most entrepreneurial country. What does that tell you? Uganda has something to sell. Uganda is the world's friendliest country. Uganda has the world's best weather. Those are things to sell. Mount Rwenzori has more peaks than Mount Kilimanjaro. We have 3 peaks, ice-covered, snow-covered peaks, than Mount Kilimanjaro. We have more gorillas than Rwanda. What does that tell you? So why aren't people coming here? In my opinion, it is a marketing job.
So what advice would you give? Do we need to put in more money? Do we need to use our embassies? What do we need to do? What is it exactly that is missing that we need to plug in?
The government of Uganda is staffed by very smart people. They are very smart people, and I wouldn't even dare to try and tell them this is how you do it. What I would say is, why don't you go and emulate your neighbors? Look at what they're doing and just replicate. I mean, I know they are smart. They understand what they're doing. They have the capacity, they have the wherewithal. But today, I was actually I was hanging out with members of parliament, and it's a matter of saying they didn't know that Uganda needs to do certain things. Well, make sure that the parliament appropriates specific amounts of money to develop the country, like Uganda's trade representatives. Uganda's trade representatives have capacity to generate real market, real buyers for Uganda. That's part of the marketing. I think that's what we should end up doing.
So as we come to the end of this show, Professor Matanda, what would be your message to Ugandans who have been listening to us from the time we began?
I want to go to something you were talking about while we were off the air, so I'm not going to betray you. All I'm going to say is, I know very well it's great to live in the United States. It's a lovely place to be. It's easier to be in the United States, but I'll tell you something. There is no place like home. There is not a day that I don't miss being at home on these streets. There's not a day that I don't regret eating those tasteless pineapples. And I would like to eat a pineapple and put it in my face and get all that juice flowing down my face. It is that delicious. There's a huge difference. My ultimate message is that we cannot shift this country. We can change it. It is up to us. The United States did not become the United States in 3 months or 30 months or in 30 years. The United States became what it became in over 200 years. And what it did is it spent a long time institutionalizing itself. These small institutions that came up are the things that are going to grow this country.
I'm afraid time is not our best ally. With that, we come to the end of the show. Thank you very much, Professor Denis Matanda, for making time to speak to Radio 1 listeners. Thank you very much, dear listeners, for being part of this show. Tomorrow, 2 hours of analysis of the top events of the week on Spectrum Extra. Make sure you make a date with me, 7 to 9 p.m. Well, I've been your host, Kenneth Lukwaga-Anderson. Up next, we have the news in English with Miss Josephine Dagano. Thereafter, we'll have the Soul Train with BB Jr.
Spectrum on Radio 1 FM 90.